In 1945, the famous 32-year-old Frances Brown was found brutally murdered in her apartment at the Pine Grove Hotel on Chicago's North Side, where she could have been kept in a safe. Scrawled on the living room wall in lipstick was the message, "For God's sake, get me before I kill more, don't let the self-control hold me back." My crime was soon linked to 2 other murders on the North Side by the so-called lip murderer. As the media frenzy around this sensational incident grew, the police became increasingly desperate to catch the killer. When a 17-year-old boy named William Hearns was caught trying to buy a house on the North Side, it seemed as if they had finally found the culprit. But while William Hearns was eventually convicted of all 3 lipstick killer murders and sentenced to life in prison, many believe the investigation was mishandled, and that Hearns spent 65 years behind bars despite being innocent. As a young boy, William George Hearns gave no indication that he would grow up to be a vicious killer. He had no prior record of violence, although he did steal. Born in Evanston, Illinois, on the eve of the Great Depression in 1928, William Hearns grew up in a family plagued by stress and poverty. To escape his parents' quarrels, Hearns began wandering the streets in search of some relief from the stresses of his home life. He finally found that relief at the age of 12 when, while working at a grocery store, Hearns accidentally underpaid a customer. To make up for it, he stole a dollar bill from an apartment by reaching through the crack in the barred door. This small act of theft ignited something inside Hearns, and from there he moved on to stealing larger sums of money, as well as personal items. He soon found himself in possession of a small collection of stolen items that ranged from the expensive to the mundane, including cameras, cocktail mixers, firearms, and even tissues and underwear. According to a 1948 psychological study, he later told his parents that his stealing was a disturbing habit, something he found strangely exciting. This habit eventually got William Hearns into trouble when he was arrested at the age of 13 for breaking into the basement of a local apartment. He was eventually sent to a semi-corrective school for boys in Indiana. However, his time there seems to have been in vain, as he was arrested again the following summer. This time, the court recommended that Hearns be sent to a private institution in central Illinois. While the schools were ineffective in curbing his crime spree, they were good at one thing: Hearns proved to be an excellent student at both institutions. His grades were so good that at the age of 16 he qualified for courses at the University of Chicago as part of the Gifted and Talented Student Program. He enrolled there as an undergraduate at 17 and hoped to one day become an electrical engineer. During his time at the university, Hearns was active in extracurricular activities such as dancing and chess. He was handsome and popular, and he even had a string of girlfriends. But it seems that all of that was not enough to prevent William Hearns from reverting to his old childhood habit. This chronic habit would soon evolve into something far more hideous. The lipstick killer terrorizes Chicago. Although the murder of Frances Brown was the most famous of the crimes attributed to William Hearns due to its sensational nature, it was actually the second murder committed by the so-called lipstick killer. The first murder had come 6 months earlier, and it hadn't even made the front pages of the local newspapers. On June 5, 1945, Josephine Ross, 43, was found murdered in her home, with multiple stab wounds to the neck. A skirt was wrapped around her neck, and her wounds had been taped shut. Her home had been ransacked, but nothing appeared to have been stolen. Although police found no fingerprints at the scene, they did find some dark hairs on Ross's hand, leading them to believe they were looking for a dark-haired suspect. With so few clues available, Ross's murder seemed likely to remain unsolved, until William Hearns committed the second murder 6 months later. In December 1945, the body of Frances Brown was discovered naked in her bathroom. Brown's head was wrapped in a cloth, as had Ross's. Again, there was a noticeable lack of evidence, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Police found no fingerprints in the apartment, nor any other hint as to who the killer might be. However, there was one notable clue left for police: the strange message written on the living room wall in Brown's lipstick. Local newspapers immediately picked up the story of Frances Brown's murder, running photos of the lipstick scrawled note on their front pages and calling the perpetrator the Lipstick Killer, a nameless, faceless villain terrorizing Chicago's wealthy North Side. In the weeks that followed, the city lived in a state of terror, anxiously awaiting the discovery of another horrific crime scene. At approximately 7:30 a.m. on January 7, 1946, a man named James Degnan discovered his 6-year-old daughter, Susan, missing from her bedroom. Police swarmed the house and immediately began searching Degnan's North Side neighborhood. Investigators soon discovered a torn ransom note in Susan's room, demanding $20,000 for her safe return. The note also asked the Degnan family not to involve the police and claimed that additional orders would follow. But as police intensified their search, they discovered that the ransom note was a hoax. Around 7 p.m. that evening, Susan Degnan's severed head was found floating in a drain near the Degnan home. The ribbons that had been tied to her hair that morning were still in place. Not long after, her legs and torso were also discovered in a nearby sewer. Once again, Chicago was caught up in a sensational crime. As the public responded to the murder of Susan Degnan with fear and outrage, pressure was mounting on the Chicago police to catch the person responsible. For months, police investigated Degnan's murder, interviewing hundreds of people. But after making a few arrests and failing to solve the case, police began to despair. William Hearns becomes a suspect. On June 26, 1946, William Hearns was planning to take his girlfriend on a date. He just needed some extra cash. Hearns claimed that he originally planned to cash a $1,000 savings bond at the post office. Knowing that he would be carrying a large sum of cash that night, he decided to carry a gun. However, the post office was closed when he arrived, so Hearns was back to his old habit. He stopped at an apartment building in the same upscale neighborhood where Susan Degnan lived, and reached into an open door. Unfortunately for William Hearns, a resident noticed his presence before he had a chance to take anything. As Hearns fled the scene, 2 police officers pursued him. When cornered, the 17-year-old pulled out his gun. Hearns and the officers gave differing accounts of what happened next. According to the officers, Hearns fired at them, forcing them to shoot him. Hearns claimed that the police fired first, which is unlikely since police would never shoot an unarmed person. Whatever the case, shots were fired. In a panic, Hearns leapt at the officers and grabbed one of them. The fight ended almost comically. An off-duty police officer, still wearing his swim trunks from a day at the beach, rushed Hearns and broke a bunch of flower pots over his head, knocking him unconscious. As bad as things were for William Hearns, things were about to get much worse. After his head wound was sutured, Hearns was taken to the hospital wing of the Cook County Jail. Meanwhile, police searched Hearns' college room, his parents' home, and a locker he kept at a local train station. In the locker, they found evidence of his lifelong thievery. After taking his fingerprints, they claimed they matched those on the ransom note for the Degnan murder, a matter to be discussed later. The authorities were determined to prove William Hearns was the Lipstick Killer. So, over the next few days, he was subjected to brutal torture while being interrogated to extract a confession. As he recovered from his injuries, he was deprived of sleep, isolated from his parents, and denied access to an attorney. During one interrogation, the 17-year-old was rendered unconscious by pain, drugs, and fatigue. However, Hearns did not confess to the crimes. According to legal documents, a lie detector test was ordered immediately afterward, but Hearns was in such severe pain that it was impossible to assess an accurate reading. At another point, a doctor injected Hearns with sodium pentothal, or truth serum, without the consent of Hearns or his parents. The substance put the young man in a state of delirium. Under its influence, as he oscillated between intense pain and unconsciousness, Hearns apparently began to speak about the beginnings of a confession, suggesting that a man named George might have committed the crimes. The police determined that George was Hearns' alter ego, and took this as an admission of guilt. When the press learned of George, they declared Hearns a dangerous Jekyll and Hyde figure with a dual personality. Before William Hearns had a chance to present his case in court, the city had already determined he was guilty, while police claimed to the press that the evidence was stacking up against William Hearns. The truth is much more complicated. Police claimed that Hearns' fingerprints matched those on the ransom note left at Degnan's home. However, investigators found only 9 points of comparison between Hearns' fingerprints and those on the note, while federal standards for determining a definitive match required 12 points.